Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I grew up in a rural area of Calhoun County, West Virginia. The land we lived on had been in my father's family for many generations and was surrounded by hundreds of acres of woodlands. My sister and I were raised to respect our elders and not to question our parents. Our parents stressed attending and succeeding at school. My father was what you would call a handyman. There wasn't much that he couldn't do even though he hadn't received much schooling. My mother was a homebody and didn't care much about traveling. My sister and I were warned about the dangers in the world, especially those dangers close to home. Both our parents used to talk about the snowman. This was a terrifying spirit that lived in a hidden burial mound for most of the year. It would rise from the mound after the first snowfall and roam the area each night until the last frost. The snowman was feared by the Mingo people who once lived here in the early 1700s. My father told us that there was a great massacre of Mingo people one night, not far from our home. The snowman gathered the bodies and carried them to his hidden mound. He described the snowman as a tall, rotund being with long white hair all over the body. But the most terrifying aspect was that the snowman had no face, just long white hair draped over from its head. We were warned not to venture out in the dark. The house was kept quiet during those winter nights because we didn't want to draw the attention of the snowman. In January 1979, my sister and I were both in our early teens. One evening around 8 p.m. we were in the kitchen doing homework at the table. Our father walked in from the living room and grabbed his coat by the door, then stepped out into the night. I asked my mother what he was doing and she told me that he had forgotten to bring in the firewood for the night. No sooner had she responded to my question, my father rushed through the door. He grabbed one of the kitchen chairs and wedged it on the door. Then he opened the cellar door and retrieved his 12-gauge shotgun and a handful of pumpkin ball shells. What had he seen? He stood at the door and said, "The snowman, he's out there." I ran upstairs to the attic so I could get a look out the window. My sister was right behind me. For almost 10 minutes, we noticed no movement. Then my sister said, "Look at the garden." There it was. It was huge, maybe 8 feet high. It would stand, walk a few feet, then crouch down digging into the hard frozen ground. It continued to do this for several minutes. Then it stood up and moved closer to the house. Father was correct, there were no facial features. A second or two later it turned and moved into the woods. I never saw it again. My mother is still with us and continues to live in the old house. She says that she has heard screaming at night, but believes it's the spirits of the Mingo people killed by the snowman.
During Christmas break in grad school December 1983 to January 1984, I was part of an Everest trek. We weren't going to the summit, basically we hiked from a small mountain town airstrip to the base camp at the Khumbu Glacier where the real climbers take off from. Takes 10 days or so each way, with stops at monasteries along the way to adjust to the altitude. It was winter in Nepal, so most of the higher elevations were basically deserted. It's very cold and rocky up there, not very inviting, but starkly beautiful. The pack train had gone on ahead to set up camp and we each just hiked along at our own pace until we caught up at the end of the day. It was mid-afternoon and as I rounded a sharp corner in the tiny, narrow mountain ledge trail I encountered a creature standing on the trail in front of an ice fall. It was clearly a primate of some sort. Not huge, between 3 and 4 feet tall. Thick reddish hair like an orangutan. Long arms. We just sort of looked one another over for maybe 10 seconds and then he turned, climbed up the ice fall, maybe 20 or 25 feet, and vanished over the top. I didn't feel threatened by him at all, but was very impressed by his speed and agility. He just zoomed up the sheer ice face and was gone. He didn't seem to be startled and fleeing, just moving on. It left me nonplussed for a few minutes, but eventually I resumed hiking. When I told our Sherpa guide about it, he said it was a Yeti. Although his English was spotty, I got the impression there was a range of animals they considered to be a Yeti, not just the Johnny Quest type Abominable Snowman we talk about over here. So whatever else is up there, at least in the early 1980s there were smallish apes with excellent climbing skills.
I was the last worker at a camp up in Alaska about 7 years ago. I was in charge of making sure all the equipment was locked up and the machinery was turned off before sunset. I checked and rechecked everything before signing off on the paperwork and turned the last switch off to head for the helicopter. I was so looking forward to a big rest and going home to Grandma's cooking. I got a really strange feeling just before I pulled down the main lever to shut off the power. I felt watched and like someone or something didn't want me to. I was totally all alone. I heard this loud ticking but didn't see anything. Then there was a loud bang. Again, there was nobody around. I thought maybe one of the guys stayed behind to scare me. I called out and nobody answered. I said, "Okay, you got me. Let's go home now." Still nothing, not a sound. I put my hand on the lever and there was a thump. Something was messing with me. I called out again, but nothing answered. I pulled the lever and everything went quiet, with no generator buzzing or humming. I walked out to the helicopter and heard grinding footfalls behind me. I looked back and didn't see anything, but I felt I wasn't alone. I kept going to the copter garage, and those steps came up again. I heard ticks and a grunt, like something blew out of its big nose. I wanted to look, but I wanted to leave more. I wished someone were there with me, even a dog or something. This was the first time I felt afraid to be alone, and I have camped deep in the wilderness since I was 18. It was quiet except for my footsteps, then it cut the air. A loud moan-wailing yell that echoed like I never heard before. It's like it surrounded me and trailed off toward the trees. I took off in a full sprint to the copter garage. I didn't look back or around, I just wanted to leave so bad. I fell to the ground and got up. This loud crack came from the building. I got the garage door lock open, jumped in the copter, and started her up. The roof lifted and I was so relieved to sail up. I did a circle to gain altitude and looked down. I saw this tall, white giant figure looking up at me. It was over 10 feet tall and wide. It raised its giant arms up like it was going to stretch up and grab at the copter. I froze and couldn't take my eyes off it, but looking at it terrified me. It let out this loud, strange metallic moan that I could hear over the blades. I rose higher and didn't look back. I didn't return to that job the next season.
The Chuchunaa, outcast, or fugitive, also known as the Chuchunaa, is a hominid cryptid rumored to live in the snowy depths of Siberia. They are unique among their kind for numerous reasons, not the least of which appearing before eyewitnesses clothed in animal skins. This fact that the Chuchunaa are said to wear animal skins has led some researchers to believe that these creatures may have less in common with Gigantopithecus-like creatures such as Bigfoot or the Yeti, and may possibly be a part of what some have speculated are a relic population of Paleoasiatic aborigines or possibly even Neanderthals. The Chuchunaa has been described by most eyewitnesses as being tall, 6 to 7 feet, and human-like, with broad shoulders, a large protruding brow, long, matted hair and occasionally bearing unusual fur coloration. It is said that at least one member of this species was given a name by nearby natives. They called him Mechani, which translates from the native Nasai dialect as the marked one, due to the fact that this creature allegedly bore a distinctive patch of white hair on its forearm. Most reports of these creatures hail from native nomadic tribes such as the Yakuts and the Tungus. The tales are much like the Native Americans' reports of Bigfoot or, as they say, Sasquatch. The creatures inhabiting the more southern areas are notorious for their midnight raids on barns and other dwellings. It appears the creatures are the same thing, just in different regions. There are also reports that these creatures have, on occasion, taken to eating human flesh. There were tales of a strange being wandering the remote forests of Tunguska near the scenes of devastation. The nomadic reindeer herdsmen of Siberia sighted the gigantic gray humanoid figure some 50 miles north of the Chuchunaa River. They saw the man, who seemed to be over 8 feet in height, picking berries and drinking water from a stream. The superstitious Mongol herdsmen regarded the freakish-looking stranger as one of the fabled Chuchunaa. Others who supposedly investigated one of mankind's greatest mysteries, the Tunguska blast, have also claimed to have seen the Chuchunaa. In 1933, Professor P. Dravert, after hearing accounts that the Chuchunaa were being hunted, petitioned the Soviet government to put an end to the practice, calling for the creatures to be recognized as full citizens of the Soviet Union and therefore deserving of equal rights under the law. His call to action went unheeded at the time, but as recently as 1970, geologist Vladimir Pushkarev was conducting research on the creatures, concluding that their numbers were dwindling as civilization encroached on their territory. In 1985, British anthropologist Myra Shackley claimed to have seen the Chuchunaa with her own eyes.
Russian novelist Ivan Turgenev met someone that he described as a troglodyte. The horror of the encounter remained in his mind throughout his entire life. Years later, he told the story to one of his French friends, Guy de Maupassant. who wrote,
I remember a story that Turgenev told us. He was hunting in a Russian forest. He was wandering the whole day, and in the evening he went out to a bank of a quiet river. The river was flowing in the shadow of trees. The water there was crystal pure and cold. Turgenev was gripped with a desire to swim in that water. He took his clothes off and jumped in the river. He was a tall, strong, well-built man, and he was a very good swimmer too. He was enjoying the current of the river with his body and soul. Grass and aquatic plants were caressing him. Suddenly, someone's hand touched his shoulder. He looked around quickly and saw a strange creature. The creature was gazing at him with great curiosity. It looked like something in between a woman and a monkey. The creature had the wrinkled face of a monkey. Messy red hair was framing the face and flowing behind the back. Turgenev was flabbergasted. Horror chilled him to the bone. He started swimming to a bank of the river, not even trying to understand what he just saw. However, the creature was swimming beside him, touching his neck and back and feet. Finally, the young man reached the ground and ran as fast as he could. He did not care about either his clothes or rifle. He forgot about everything and was guided only by the immense uncontrollable wish to stay alive. The monster was following him. It was running very fast too, uttering some squealing sounds. The young man could hardly catch his breath. He was about to fall down on the ground, but he suddenly saw a boy with a whip in his hands. The boy started whipping the creature and it ran away, yelling with pain. The courage of the little shepherd is explained with the fact that it was not the first time that he saw it. Later, some of the local residents told Turgenev that the monster was a crazy woman that was living alone in the forest and went completely insane. Turgenev made himself believe in such an explanation. Yet, it was known in the 19th century that people do not get covered with thick hair all over their body, even if they lived alone in the woods.
In 1990, a shepherd's wife once said that she saw a Bigfoot not far from the pasture. The Bigfoot was standing on a high rock. She started pleading with her husband to leave that horrid place and go to another pasture. The man did not agree, although he got anxious about it, too. He started searching for Bigfoot. He saw their tracks, but never saw a living one. One evening he heard his wife screaming very loudly. He grabbed his rifle and rushed outside. The wife was lying on the ground, almost unconscious. She was speechless and could not say a word. She could only point her finger in the direction of the rocks. The shepherd gazed in the direction that she was pointing and saw the silhouette of a running man. He did not hesitate and fired his rifle. In the morning the shepherd found blood spots on the rocks. Amish thought that those creatures would not come back to their pasture anymore. He was so wrong. Amish's life turned into a nightmare. Several days later he found his little son dead. There was no trace of violence on the boy's body, only a little wound on his neck. Amish was sure that his boy was killed by a Bigfoot. He went mad and swore to himself that he would take revenge for his son. He was spending days and nights sitting outside his house, waiting for a Bigfoot to come back. But it was all in vain. One night he fell asleep, and when he entered his house in the morning, he found the dead body of his wife. Again, there was only a small red wound on her neck. Amish let out a scream of grief and desperation. He started wandering in the woods, having forgotten about his sheep and house and food. He was desperately gripped with anger. The only thing that was on his mind was to kill a Bigfoot for the death of his family. Shepherd Shepek took care of Amish's sheep. One day he suddenly saw the sheep getting very troubled and excited. They were bleating and rushing from one side to another. The animals were apparently frightened by something. Shepek could only see a silhouette of a man covered with thick fur disappearing amid bushes and trees. Then he saw another man on the ground. Shepek ran up to him and recognized Amish. The shepherd was already dead. Blood was leaking from a small wound on his neck. Who knows, maybe nothing would have happened if the shepherd had not fired his rifle first. Russian cryptozoologist Viktor Rogov relates an encounter in the Kola Peninsula near the Lovozer Lake. The lack of trepidation towards humans, even though it was not threatened, is an interesting characteristic.
In the summer of 1988, together with Maya Baikova, the author of numerous articles and a large monograph about the mysterious relic hominoid, Misha Gavrilov chose a place for our next expedition. Rather unexpectedly, we received a message from Lake Lovozer, the then closed area of the Kola Peninsula. The message said that several residents came across Yeti. We had received messages of this kind before, but the last information proved that Yeti was noticed close to an inhabited locality. Moreover, Yeti terrorized a small hut in the southern part of the lake, a place where fishermen stayed for the night when they went fishing in the lake. It was actually very difficult for me and the other two members of the expedition to reach the mentioned place where the hut stood. We settled in the hut and were waiting for Yeti there. The Yeti visited the place on the very first night of our stay in the hut. At daybreak, we heard a loud noise from a landfill. Someone big was forcing his way through the bushes and rattled the tins. Unfortunately, the windows of the hut didn't face the side from where the noise came, and we were too scared to leave the hut. On the third night, someone tried to open the door of the hut, then jumped on the roof and walked on it for a long time. Fortunately, the roof was strong enough to withstand the heavy walking. The next morning, we saw many footprints left by some unknown animal. One footstep was 34 centimeters long. When we inspected the area in the daytime, besides the large footsteps, we discovered smaller ones. In a mountain crack, we found a rookery where the animal could remain unnoticed and watch us. You should agree that this animal must be intelligent and have at least some skills. We managed to see the strange creature for the first time only on the fourth night. The Yeti was walking around the hut, and its head was on the level of the hut's only window, at the height of about 3 meters. And when we saw the objective of our expedition in the moonlight, we were extremely shocked. We felt a wild, almost animal fear. We felt as if we wanted to run away and hide somewhere, but at the same time, we couldn't stop watching the Yeti. Later, we saw the creature several times, and each time we saw the Yeti, an awful fear anticipated its approaching. When we felt the strange fear, we realized that the Yeti was somewhere nearby. The creature resembled a huge anthropoid ape, 2.75 to 3 meters high, with broad shoulders and strong muscles. The body was covered with light gray hair of average length. It was almost white on the buttocks. The neck was short and strong, the forehead was low, and the jaws were protruded. The face of the creature was almost naked, without hair, covered with dark wrinkles. The eyes were small and angry. Almost at once we understood that the creature was angry because we intruded on its territory and it came to drive us away. We were awfully scared and couldn't take even a single picture of him. After the expedition, we brought material proof of the Yeti's existence to Moscow: hair, gypsum copies of its footprints, feces, and drawings. However, unfortunately, no pictures. We sent the hair to the Institute of the Ministry for Internal Affairs for an analysis. The specialists said that the hair didn't belong to any known animal. That was our last expedition. Since that time, I haven't had a chance to meet with Misha Garverlov, the third member of the expedition. He left the hut early in the morning without even saying goodbye. Maya Baikova died 3 years after the expedition.
A few years ago, I got a job doing camera work for a Discovery special on the Yeti. That special never aired, and here I am breaking my NDA to say why, because I think these events need to be made known. I'm a professional photographer and cameraman by trade, specifically nature photography, but a gig is a gig. I knew a friend from college who worked for Discovery, filming for some of their extreme nature shows. You know, like Bear Grylls, surviving shows, or those ones that follow a reporter into some cool Egyptian tomb. I was doing mostly wedding photography at the time, but always wanted to do something like my friend was doing for Discovery. As luck would have it, he became seriously ill right before he was scheduled to fly out to Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal, for a new TV special on the Yeti. He put in my name and they offered me his job. I happily accepted. I was so excited. It was a free trip to Nepal and a reality TV gig. I got all my stuff together and drove down to LA to meet my sick friend. I lived in Seattle at the time. He let me use his equipment and I was very grateful to him for getting me the job. Don't sweat it. Have fun over there and make sure you listen to what they want you to do. You'll be going into some pretty rough terrain. It's hard work, so stay hydrated. The physical part was no problem for me. I walked a lot and also liked to run marathons. I thanked him again and took off for the airport. The plane ride was long, really long, but otherwise uneventful. I mainly needed a nap as my back was killing me from the seats and the jet lag on top. At the airport I met the others in the crew. There was one other cameraman, Willie, who knew my friend from back home. Then there was the show's host, an Aussie named Rob, and Rob's assistant producer, Karen. I have to tell you guys, as soon as I got out of the airport I felt like I walked into a wall of pollution. The city Kathmandu is huge, dense, smelly, and noisy. Nepal borders India, so if you've ever been there, or seen places like Delhi on TV, Nepal is not much different. Willie, who was also Filipino and blended in better with the locals, hailed us a cab. We all went to a Western hotel. Karen informed me that she would be staying at the hotel, and we would be meeting a local guide she arranged for us. The rest of the day I mainly walked around near the hotel, ate some local food, and took some photos with my own camera. Me and Karen were the only ones still awake at this point. I still felt weird despite being exhausted from the flight, so we walked down a bit to a nearby square we heard some music coming from. There were about 20 or so people there crowded around this Nepalese man who was dancing in a circle while some other men played drums and an instrument I couldn't name. It was some sort of flute. The dancer was wearing a golden silk gown and a papier-mâché mask. The mask was interesting, as it looked like what you'd see during Chinese New Year. Painted bright red, with intricate yellow and green patterns surrounding orb-like white eyes and 2 long fangs that slanted outward from the mouth hole. The mask also had long bright red hair that covered the dancer's head entirely, so all you saw was the mask and his body. Karen was able to speak a bit of Nepali, and gesturing to the dance she asked one of the drummers what the mask was. He looked confused at her poor Nepali for a moment, then laughed and simply said, "Laki." Later at the hotel, I googled, on the brutally slow internet, what a Laki was, and apparently it's some sort of demon from Nepalese folklore that protects townspeople. I shut off my laptop and then managed to get a nice long sleep. The next day we met our guide Sherpa, Harish. He was from a village about 8 hours northeast of Kathmandu, going up into the Himalayas. We put our equipment into a rented truck and then up we drove through the city, then the poor slum/suburbs beyond before finally mountainous farmland. Rob got Willie to film him interviewing Harish for a bit as he drove. Harish told us he had seen glimpses of the Yeti as a boy, and the beast left footprints in the sand near rivers and streams. Many of the villages near him had reported sightings too, but often some kids go looking on their own, he says, but mostly they get lost out in the dense mountain jungle. Sometimes they will come back with scratches and bruises, usually from falling, tripping, or even sometimes bites from snakes. Harish continued explaining that the local legends of the Yeti became world famous when Western explorers began coming to Nepal for exploration, mainly around the early 20th century. The myths exploded as more mountaineers came hoping to see a glimpse of the Bigfoot cousin on their climb up the various mountains, the most famous obviously being Mount Everest. Harish claims the Yeti exists but understands why many Westerners and even those from the cities are more skeptical, because there are other great apes like orangutans in the jungle which people could think are the Yeti. We stopped filming and let Harish drive. It took us almost all day and it was not a pleasant ride. Most of the roads were little more than dirt paths, and some spots were very high up, overlooking gorges with nothing but flimsy aluminum barriers to protect your vehicle if it careened off the road. We reached his village at about 9 p.m. local time. I was expecting some wooden hut village like you saw on TV, but this village was more like a small town. They had power, concrete buildings, and a few paved, albeit poorly, streets. Most of the buildings though were shanty huts, with aluminum ceilings and wood or old concrete as walls. Harish took us to the only hotel in town, which was a simple 2-story motel. We agreed to meet early in the morning, around 5 a.m., since Harish said that was the best time to potentially get a sighting. The hotel room was what you would expect from the third world, a bare-bones mattress that was right on the ground, a hole in the ground with a plastic cover for a toilet and a hose with nozzle for a shower. Luckily the motel restaurant served some decent chicken. I managed to get a few hours of sleep, but slept in my clothes as the nights got very cold that high up in the Himalayan foothills. I woke up and met the crew bright and early. Harish drove us a bit away from the village, but not too far as we'd have to go the rest of the way on foot. He said most sightings are near a stream that runs at the bottom of a gorge. However, the Nepal government was building a dam just north of the village and most of the river was dried up, so we could walk along the sandy banks. The river was not far from the road, maybe a 15 minutes walk through the jungle. I could see what the dam was doing to the gorge. The water was confined to a small stream in the middle of what must have once been a great river. On either side, as Harish said, were sandy banks and rocks. Me and Willie began filming at this point and we began trekking north. On either side of the gorge were steep tree-covered hills and you could see in the distance the first mountains of the Himalayas. Every so often we would stop and Harish would explain to Rob a bit more about the Yeti and Rob would relay his own opinions as well. Harish would point out various animal tracks, including bears and even a tiger, so we had reference for when he showed us the real Yeti footprint up ahead. We trekked on for what felt like an hour, following the dried-up river bank. My friend back home was certainly right about it being tough terrain. I consider myself pretty fit, but even this was getting tough as we kept going uphill. Eventually we hit a turn in the river marked to my right by a steep cliff face. Harish beckoned us over to show some sort of ape-like footprint in the dried river sand. I kept filming as Rob asked some questions about how the villagers found it. Could it just be a regular ape/orangutan, that sort of thing? The footprint was pretty odd though, even if it was an orangutan. It was about the size of a bear but definitely humanoid/apish in shape with 4 toes and a larger opposable toe. We took photos of the print and then used the opportunity to have a lunch break. The footprint was weird but interesting, I thought at the time. Looking back, this is where I wish we had stopped. After lunch, Harish told us that the Yeti is probably an undiscovered ancestor or relative to apes. He says it likes to live in caves, and has evidence. The cave mention was given to Karen, who told Rob, weeks ago, so it was no surprise to Rob. These nature productions are all generally scheduled well in advance with guides, so there are no surprises. We packed our stuff and began to hike up into the jungle towards this cave, up the steep terrain near the cliffside. When I thought the hike up the river was tough, I hadn't experienced a real hike yet. Back home I would hike around Seattle and near Portland when I would visit my parents, but trails cannot compare to walking through unexplored Himalayan jungle bush. Not to mention I had 60-odd pounds of AV equipment on my back. The jungle is certainly a unique place though. You are introduced to a whole new soundscape, from monkeys yelling at each other, tons of different birds, the rustling of vegetation, even some weird chirps from insects I couldn't even name to you. Eventually the constant uphill battle took a turn south, literally. Harish led us downhill until we were standing face to face with this cave. It had a low ceiling, maybe 5 feet, but was quite wide, about the length of a city bus. The entrance was covered in thick bush except a cutaway hole where presumably this Yeti entered and exited. At the moment Willie began to film Rob and Harish entering the cave, a shrill shriek came from behind the area we hiked up. I nearly fell over and my muscles went stiff. Instinctively, I swung my camera around but couldn't locate where the shriek had come from. Rob turned, with a look of concern. Willie and Harish, on the other hand, were grinning at me. Willie had his camera pointed into the treetops and was holding back a laugh to keep his camera steady. Willie pointed up and told us to look up there. I followed his gaze to see a small brown monkey hanging from a branch. Howling monkey. Haha, looks like you saw a ghost, nah? The anxiety in me slowly let down as the monkey screamed again right at us a couple more times before taking off into the treetops. I must have met the biggest sigh of my life and we turned to go into the cave. Rob interviews Harish again before entering. Harish said some local boys found this place and they saw the Yeti leaving the cave. Rob made a little joke and then we went into the cave. As you would expect, the cave was pitch black. Good thing we had lights on our cameras in addition to night vision. The cave didn't seem to go that far back, but it was difficult to tell. The ceiling seemed to get lower and lower as you went in. Rob was walking sort of backgrounds, talking to the camera as he spoke about the history of the Yeti sightings, that sort of thing. We started having to duck our heads as the ceiling kept getting lower and the light from the entrance grew smaller. We were maybe 30 yards in. Rob was talking. The first Western sighting of the Yeti was in 1832 when he stopped as his foot hit something. He mumbled and turned to see how big the rock was to move around it. Only when he turned and shined his headlight on the ground his foot had not hit a rock. I could see through my camera a humanoid mass on the ground, like someone in the fetal position. Rob jumped back and Harish went to go see what was wrong. He turned the man over, who was completely naked and covered in filth. Harish looked up at me. The man was clearly a Westerner. He had a shaggy beard, was very skinny and looked extremely dehydrated. He was still alive though, mumbling something and holding himself. There were 2 small holes in the side of the man like some sort of bite. A bat maybe? We were in a cave and the man had clearly been here for some time. We thought he was a lost tourist or mountaineer at first, but then Harish picked up a piece of plastic near the man and held it up to me. I read it out loud: Jacques Richard, ingénieur. Ingénieur, French for engineer. He must work at the dam. Harish explained that the dam was partially funded by the French government and the World Bank. We agreed he must have gotten lost and went to help him up when the same shriek from the howler monkey emerged from the cave entrance. I turned, slowly, keeping my camera rolling. Through the lenses I saw a very tall, dark, lanky figure standing in the cave entrance. It had no clothing, no fur, just a huge head of hair that was completely dark like the rest of its silhouette. I could make out the monkey's squirming body in the creature's mouth. It screamed again, then there was a crunch and a sick slurping noise. All I could make out from the silhouette were two enormous, beady, white eyes staring at my camera.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.